On behalf of the Education Cluster's Information Management Community of Practice, I would like to welcome all of you to today's webinar on volunteer technical communities and the Digital Humanitarian Network. It is becoming increasingly apparent to us that networks of technical volunteers have the capacity to effectively work alongside humanitarian organizations and can do so from virtually anywhere in the world. In fact, we are beginning to realize they offer us enormous potential to improve our humanitarian action. And so it gives me great pleasure to present to you our guest speaker for today's webinar, Andre Verity. Andre is not only an information management officer for OCHA, but he is also the co-founder of the Digital Humanitarian Network.
As Lauren mentioned, I have a day job, which is working at UN OCHA, based here in Geneva, with a large focus on information management, and that focus being directed towards supporting our field offices with tools, guidance, and so forth. But what started out being largely a volunteer time passion of mine was starting to engage with a lot of these volunteer and technical communities, even before they were called that. And I was doing this a lot in evenings, weekends, and when deployed to emergencies, I was doing a lot of it even late in the evenings after we had left the office, because I knew that people remotely could help me do things that I was not able to do in country, either with my capacity or we just perhaps didn't have the bandwidth. So before I give you too much detail about the Digital Humanitarian Network, I wanted to go through a bit of the history behind this. So although some of these groups started before 2009, I think 2009 was one of the big years for things to really change, because there was a lot of people realizing that they could support crises or affected areas using technology remotely. But as individuals, they weren't necessarily sure how to do that. And different people were trying to figure that out, and there was a group called the Crisis Mappers, which was created. I assume some of you may be on that mailing list, and essentially that's what it was. It was a Google group, and they started holding annual conferences once a year, and bringing practitioners, and it brought together, it didn't matter where you were coming from. You could be an individual, passionate individual, you could be an organization, you could be from a private company, and so forth. So it was really starting to bring together all these people who were interested in supporting emergencies from a digital standpoint. Probably one of the big changes, and in a matter of a few months after that, we go into 2010, and as I assume all of you have heard, and were very aware of at the time, was the Haiti earthquake. And what we saw out of the Haiti earthquake was really many of these individuals and groups starting to come back together, or should say come back together, forming into groups. So one of the famous stories around Haiti is the OpenStreetMap, and so much volunteerism happening there, and from that the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team was formed. The standby volunteer task force team was formed. And so a lot of volunteer organizations actually started to form as a result of Haiti. And so I depict that here by these different circles. Essentially, volunteers starting to realize that they could come together around common themes and/or activities. Let's see if we get this slide to change there. In 2011, one of the big points for how the Digital Humanitarian Network concept came about was as a result of some work that OCHA we were doing. So I had been having a lot of conversations with these different volunteer groups since Haiti, both in person and virtually. And so when Libya happened, we had staff that were being evacuated from the country. So rather than people going in, everyone was leaving. And it was very difficult to understand what was going on inside of the country. And so what we did was we actually called a conference with a handful of our partners, several of the volunteer groups that we knew at the time, and asked them in this group for ideas. And one of them was that we could do a live crisis map. And in behind that, we also asked that same group to be collecting who's doing what where information from verifiable sources. Although they were scouring that from social media and traditional media and news, we were then able to take that information, and although we had it on this flashy interactive map that people could click on and try to drill into, Well, we're actually, the big feature that most people didn't realize is we were actually pulling a lot of that data out and putting it into our existing infographics and maps. It's documented in the data source, but for people, they were then consuming something that they were used to. They were consuming something that could be printed. So we were really using the volunteers in some ways to help augment existing products and processes. And that 3W, for example, I was able to create a 3W with more information in 3 or 4 days than I was able to do in 2 weeks in Haiti when I was there in person. So we really started to recognize that these things could change and could be done differently. What resulted after Libya was we said, okay, we need to figure out what went well, what went wrong, and put a bunch of these volunteer groups and some academics in a room. And there were several thematic areas of things that were mentioned in a workshop, sort of trying to figure out what do we need to address. And so there were several topics that came about. I'm just trying to use a highlight tool, but you can see on the screen here issues around how do we manage large groups of volunteers, how do we deal with data licensing, in the UN and large NGO and satellite imagery community. They don't like to release a lot of data for random groups of volunteers to work on. How do we coordinate people when they're scrambling for data, which is often overlaps, but people are all doing it their own way. How do we identify who the decision makers are, what do they actually need? How do we measure the impact of the collaboration, the work they're doing, so we can repurpose them in live time, not UN or global cluster real time, which usually takes 3 to 6 months, but real time, like within hours. And then there's one that's mentioned here at the bottom, which was the Humanitarian Standby Task Force. And we started talking about that concept. We had a couple discussions. What we decided was we didn't need yet another group of volunteers. What we needed to do was bring these volunteers together in a bit of a sort of an umbrella, which we call the Digital Humanitarian Network. And what that was going to do is fulfill two, let's say, relatively simple purposes. One is to let you know, and then in many cases myself even know, what these different volunteer groups are that are out there, or even private companies are providing a digital service free of charge according to the demands of a requesting organization. So what you see on this slide, and I'll run through these quickly. From the upper left, you have Translators Without Borders, which is about 2,000, 2,500 professional translators around the world who their aim is to translate content into local languages. We have the HOT team, which is the Humanitarian Open Street Map team. You have UNV, which has online volunteering services, so you can put up what they call opportunities and you can source volunteers. On the next sort of row down, you have DataKind, which is a large group of data scientists. You have one called GIS Corp, which is about 2,000, 2,500 professional GIS officers around the world, mostly virtual, but some deploy. The one that looks like a TF here, that's the Standby Volunteer Task Force. It's 1,000 volunteers of a wide range of skills, from media monitoring to geolocation to verification and analysis. The one that looks like a bit of an egg turned on its side is Statistics Without Borders. It's about 500 professional statisticians, mostly based in the U.S., but available to provide virtual support. And then you have Humanity Road in the lower left, which is a smaller group of volunteers with extremely passionate, self-activating in emergencies, very much aimed at collecting information to give to the population to help them find assistance as they need it. Esri provides a certain technical platform. I assume many of you are aware of it, and they'll provide that to at times requesting agencies or to these digital humanitarian network entities to provide some online GIS mapping. The one that looks like a green smiley face is Geeks Without Bounds, and these are the ones that run things like the Random Acts of Kindness crisis camps, also act as a tech incubator for humanitarian technology, and Map Action. And these, as some of you will probably know, are what I would call real hardcore volunteers. They're the ones who take vacations from their day job and go out to the field for 2 to 3 weeks in an emergency. So it's really bringing together a wide range of these groups. And what the DH network then does is it provides you an entry point to find these different groups. So you don't have to keep track of all of them. These groups now are learning about who each other are, so they actually start working together. So if you had a request, and we'll talk about later, these different groups can come together in a solution team to work with you. So you might have to do a mapping, a geolocation of schools, but all the information is in a local language you don't understand. So you could actually bring together then Translators Without Border, perhaps with GIS Core, and a Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, and all of that data could be originally translated, then geolocated, and put onto the OpenStreetMap or whatever platform it is that you may want to use. So to give you an idea of some of the deployments of the Digital Humanitarian Network, or requests for activation, the very first was related to South Sudan for OCHA. There was going to be a large interagency assessment undertaken. So the OCHA office and assessment teams requested the Digital Humanitarian Network to scour the internet looking for all kinds of different data sources and putting a whole bunch of historical data together for them to use as baseline information for the assessment. And the second one was by ACAPS, which is again around assessments, but they were building out some of their first disaster needs analysis products, and they wanted to do on DRC, and they had the volunteers scour the internet again, finding all kinds of data sources and historical data for the past sort of 5 to 10 years, really giving ACAPS an idea of what was available out there, so that when they started building future DNAs, disaster needs analysis, they could have a clear idea of where they could be going themselves to look for things on the internet. The Philippines here for UNOCHA, this was a specific one. Again, it was the assessment people who requested, but this time they asked the volunteers to scour social media looking for images or videos. So there's some automatic processing, and they got it down to originally 20,000 messages, of which then the volunteers went through and they automated as much as they could within 24 hours to come out with, I think it was approximately 150 or 170 images and or videos, which then were given back to the assessment team in the structure that they had asked for it, which is very much a very well-defined Excel spreadsheet with specific metadata and control vocabulary assigned. What was interesting in this case was some of the partners on the ground who were supposed to be working on infrastructure damage mapping said, when they found out about this later, they said this would have been a very good source of information for them because it was better information, it was more information than what they were getting from the local governments about damages in the infrastructure. So if they would have been able to get their hands on this really early, they could have put out much better products much faster than they were. It also gives access to a lot of content that the advocacy people are very interested in now, especially in terms of using the affected population's content for advocacy purposes. So we're really looking at this, trying to figure out how we standardize this and multi-purpose the work within OCHA. And the fourth one here, again, was the Samoa. Actually, was somebody in the Samoan government through UNOCHA in the South Pacific office activating, wanting a crisis map to try to get an idea of how people were being affected after a storm, to help them get an idea of where action was needed. So if there was a tree that was knocked down, they could respond to it. If somebody was injured, maybe they could redirect some local health practitioners to provide assistance. Now, what also happened in 2012 was I realized that in my role as OCHA, a lot of people were asking me, well, I don't understand how to work with these volunteers. Right? They're still, even with the Digital Humanitarian Network in place, they still felt like there's going to be a lot of volunteers, there's a lot of demands. How do we collaborate with these groups that operate very differently? What do we have to do to reward them? How do we set up our structures? What kind of technologies do we need to use? So what we produced was guidance for collaborating with the volunteer and technical communities. The electronic version for this is on the digitalhumanitarians.com website, so you can quickly find and download that in English or French. But that really can give you something you can skim through. It gives you an idea of what a volunteer and technical community is, a VTC is, things you need to think about before, things you need to think about during, and things you need to think about after an activation. It also gives you a very practical checklist of things that you should consider going through during an deployment. And in many ways, you can think of it like outsourcing. The better you articulate your request, the more engaged you are during the process, the better the result. Now, moving forward to 2013, and perhaps a couple of more interesting deployments I found. UNHCR wanted to translate their data portal to Arabic for the Syria emergency because they wanted much more wide exposure of it within the Arabic community. And in order to do that really fast, they actually turned to the Digital Humanitarian Network, who translated it. Once we had the data, I think it took about 2 days to translate the whole portal. It was even less than 2 days. And the translation was given back to UNHCR and for them to integrate into their platform. The second one, what I thought was interesting, was the floods, and these were in northern India. What I find interesting about this was we, as in the UN, and especially OCHA, were specifically told by the Indian government that we were not to respond and we were not to mention it in any way. However, a local NGO by the name of Seeds requested the Digital Humanitarian Network, and these digital volunteers then responded from wherever they were in the world. They helped with GIS, helped mapping out several. They helped with producing a who's doing what where. So they were actually doing some of the core information management work that often OCHA and or the clusters do, and sometimes send people into the countries to do. What I find interesting there was they were not being restricted by the sovereignty of nations to be able to provide these kind of services. And they were doing it almost all remotely, just with a couple liaison people from Seeds and other entities in country. Some other things that have happened, just so you know, in 2013, and I'll just go through these quickly before we get into how the interaction happens. We've released a guidance for collaborating with formal humanitarian organizations, so of less perhaps interest to many of the members here, but this is really aimed then at private companies, especially tech companies, and volunteer groups, so they can better understand the challenges and things they should do, such as developing partnerships in advance, but really giving them some guidance on how you work with a UNICEF, or work with a WFP, or work with an OCHA, or a Save the Children. How do you work with these organizations? What are the kind of challenges? What are the good things? What are the bad things about collaborating with them? That's available on the website as well. Also starting to release several of these what we call communities of interest, and these were part of the wheel diagram that was shown earlier. So now we've released some general considerations for working with volunteers, some general volunteer management guidelines. We've also released the impact evaluation framework, so it gives a few pages about measuring impact on how to collaborate, the collaboration efforts between the volunteers and the formal organization, but also provides a templated tool that you can copy and start measuring. So if you score values every day, you can start to see the trend over time, so you can quickly see, is efficiency increasing or decreasing? Is effectiveness increasing, decreasing? Is the impact of the specific project increasing, decreasing? Is the collaboration efforts improving or not? And it's completely customizable. All the instructions are there, so you can change the categories, you can change the questions that go underneath it, and so on. But that is something there that can really help get you set up and measuring in real time. Another one was the decision makers, and my, let's say, pet peeve I've had in the past is quite often I hear people say, I'm creating this product or I'm creating this service for the decision makers. And whenever I stop somebody and I say, okay, but which decision maker? They often have a blank stare on their face because they're not sure what I mean, and they don't know which decision makers. Sometimes people can generally say, well, this is for the public, or this is for the senior management of my organization, and sometimes that gives them a bit of guidance. But essentially there was no common ways to think about this, no structure or framework to the discussion. So what we did was we had a couple of people work on trying to come up with a generalized taxonomy of the humanitarian decision makers. Now, you can download this from the website. It's a big document. You can print it out in large scale or at A3. It will not fit your mental model. You will have something in here you disagree with, I guarantee, but that's not the purpose to get it perfect. The purpose is to start getting you thinking about this, just get you start thinking about where are these different types of decision makers, where are they, a decision maker who's in country at a subnational level has a very different decision that they have to make versus somebody sitting at the capital level versus somebody at the international level. And the different kind of people in the military versus public sector versus the diaspora, they're going to be making very different kinds of decisions. So when you start thinking of your products that you're designing or producing, start thinking about what decision makers. This is where the volunteers really are pushing back on, because they say, what decision makers, what decisions are we trying to enable? How, what is the value of this work? Who are we influencing? So this is for, I think people should be doing this inside their own organizations or clusters. But even when you start collaborating with the volunteers, these are the hard questions you might start to get. And the one that will come out in a couple of weeks, and I won't spend in much detail, we've done, let's say, a literature review, a bit of a study on trying to figure out the right governance model and organization around digital humanitarianism. So it's really focused much more on the DHNetwork and some of these, but many of the concepts I suspect you'll start to see in the future in humanitarian organizations that are already perhaps being applied in private companies. So that report will probably be released. It's not necessarily an official digital humanitarian network document, but we'll be trying to get it out publicly through Crisis Mappers on my personal blog and some different places. So now, getting back to the original probably interest that you may have in a digital humanitarian network, and it's the question of how does it work, right? How are you going to work? How are you going to activate? What does this mean? How much effort do you need to put into it? So the diagram that I've pulled up in front of you here is essentially one of the purposes of the digital humanitarian network, and that is to provide that thin layer of interface. So on the left-hand side, we have what we can see is sort of generally the very square, the very organized, formal humanitarian responders, and on the right we have the a little bit more messy, much more dynamic, much more fluid volunteer groups. What I found was many of the formal organizations didn't know how to interact with these volunteer groups, right? They would hear volunteers, they think there's going to be thousands of people knocking on their door to help them. So we said, no, what we need is a way for these formal hierarchical organizations to understand how to interact with these volunteer groups. So the Digital Humanitarian Network is there, right? It provides both that thin interface, but allows you to articulate your request, send it as an activation request. Then the Digital Humanitarian Network has 4 coordinators who look at your request and they collaborate with you to refine it. And then they work with the volunteer groups to find the right entities, or which may be 1, 2, 3, or more, who then come together as a solution team, and that team comes back to you. So to give you, here is a little bit more detail on the activation process. So step number 1 is obviously, if UNICEF wanted to geolocate all of the temporary educational facilities after a major flood, they could provide that request to the Digital Humanitarian Network with as much information as they had, whether it's satellite imagery, written notes, a messy Excel spreadsheet, or anything like that. This would go to the coordinators, who have very recently been replaced. They change coordinators regularly. So those coordinators would then make sure it fits the basic criteria. So essentially it's coming from a humanitarian organization, and it's not aimed at anything harmful. And so then a decision to accept or not accept. If it's not accepted, they try to refer to either somebody else, or maybe one of the entities will still take the work. If it's accepted, then there might be a call again with the organization if there's more details. But then within the Digital Humanitarian Network, they decide who are the members that need to come together, and they form that solution team and come back and work. That solution team works directly with you as the requesting organization. And the aim is for this to happen all within 24 hours or less. Obviously, it depends on how well you articulate your request, and it depends on how urgent the request is in terms of the emergency. So one of the examples, and this I just pulled off of the website so that you could see it, and then also go and you could download the exact same thing. So the example here was similar to what I was just describing. If there was a disaster, and in this case, all the data sources were lost for hospitals and field hospitals. So perhaps WHO needs to make a request, right? So we could imagine the same thing in the education cluster. All the information and data is lost about where all the schools are because there's a major earthquake and the government doesn't have the data. We don't know where all of the schools actually are, or where the temporary schools are being set up. So the request comes to the Digital Humanitarian Network. And in the example in front of you, they would submit the online form. I can take you at the end to show you the website, to show you where that is. Or you can actually just send an email to activate@digitalhumanitarians.com. Then that goes into a bit of a review process. The solution team comes together, and in this case they say if this would be HOT, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, and the Standby Task Force, they would come together, and in this instance those two entities would then work directly with WHO. So think of it as the digital network then steps away. They've enabled that connection and that solution team to come and then work directly for you, right? So it isn't necessarily the digital humanitarian network we're doing work, but these entities have come together to do work for you. Just to give you an idea of some of the things that they do work on, the different groups, there's quite a wide range, so this is just a sampling, right? So it goes through media monitoring, and this could be social media, mainstream media, regular news, and so on. Do a lot of geolocation, right? That was the past example. They do a lot of live crisis mapping, if that's relevant. They actually do, they've helped us clean data in the past, even before there was digital humanitarian network. They've done a lot of help, and they can do a lot of help on collecting, even developing, but definitely cleaning data. A lot of GIS work. They can produce products, online, offline products. There's big data analysis type people. Right, I mentioned satellite imagery. A couple of points here I found interesting. They can help with a lot of statistical analysis. And one point there I found interesting was in Haiti, we had one statistician in the tent. It was 40 degrees, planes going over every 3 minutes, and she was being all by herself trying to figure out and make sure the data was statistically valid and massage it and make it work. And she was working crazy hours and literally pulling her hair out. And all I could think at the time was there's got to be a better way. And now I would say to someone like that, if this really is work that needs to be done, that's so much and so time-consuming, you're such a terrible environment, you need to think about, calling in the volunteers, the Statistics Without Borders. They can provide help. Why do I need one person in country? We're going to have one person. I could have 10, 20, 50 people helping from abroad. You just need to figure out how to break those tasks down. And the ninth one here is the translations into local languages. So Translators Without Borders, very keen to do that. We've already had discussions with them about how to translate the official OCHA SITREP and take it and translate it into local languages in new emergencies. It wouldn't be branded as an OCHA SITREP. It would be branded as being generated from the OCHA SITREP, but really looking at how do we translate SITREPs and material into local languages. Because I know for Haiti, as an easy example, we produced a situation report in English. It took us a long time to start doing the French, which I thought was quite interesting and a bit strange. But why could we not find somebody within the UN or large NGOs that was sitting virtually, sitting away from the emergency, who could translate into Creole? Now, there's other countries, more specific languages, maybe we can't do that. But Translators Without Borders has 2,500 volunteers and a wider network. And I think we can start making much more of our material available in local languages if we set up the process in advance and set our minds to actually sort of wrap up before I go to the website, where I talk to a lot of people. I talk about this, it's a change. You really have to sometimes stop and think. It's going to be different. You're going to have to adapt. When you have people in country in emergencies, they have to think about how can I break this work up that I'm doing into pieces? How can I send this to a bunch of group of people virtually? It's hard to do. You're sitting down. You have people in front of you demanding work. So how do you adapt to that? How do you start to think differently? And what you'll also find is that working with these kind of groups who are much more tech savvy, very willing to try and do new things, you as an individual and as an organization will start to change and innovate. So for example, in OCHA, one of my past roles was managing a community of practice inside of OCHA, our IAM community of practice. And before that, the support from the headquarters to the field was always the field emailing headquarters asking for support. And after I started working with the volunteers, I said, no, we need to do this different inside OCHA. And we were approached because they knew we were doing some work. They said, okay, to me and my section, you can now start using Skype officially as a pilot. So what we did was we pretty much instantly set up an OCHA information management Skype group. And what we found was just amazing, because now we have 130 people around the world who are helping themselves. So rather than traditionally going up to headquarters asking for an answer and we may or may not give it, now they're asking in an open discussion forum, and people are helping other people often before we even get to the office in the morning. So it really can help bring a lot of new ideas and innovative approaches into your organization and or group. And another thing to think about is there's a lot of discussions now about how do we develop new partnerships with private company, emerging companies, or emerging entities. And these groups are, again, they're a bit different. They're loose. They don't come with money. They don't have travel budgets, but they're extremely passionate. They want to do things. They want to show you how to do things. They really want to make an impact. So you have to start questioning how you set up your partnership models. What is the word partnership mean to you? How do you make that much more loose? How do you collaborate? All right. So in the UN Secretariat, where OCHA sits, partnerships has a very legal meaning. So, okay, well, maybe I just stop calling it that. I'll call it collaborating with, and it lets me have a whole bunch of informal groups that I'm working through, and it's brought in us a lot of influence from academics and from private companies, just because it enables us to have those kind of discussions. So it can actually push you in terms of your boundaries around partnerships. So what I got on the screen there, that's you can get a hold of me by email. But what I want to show you, see if I can pull this up quickly, is the website. So it's digitalhumanitarians.com, and there's a lot of material on here. So you can front page. There's a watch and a really sort of promotional video. One of the volunteers amongst all these groups did. It has a blog post that gives an update as they do different activities. So you can follow that along. It's not a blog that's putting something out every day. It's just once in a while. It lists all the different members on the left-hand side here. You can go in and you can see all of the different members and their profiles in terms of organizations. Because again, this is a network of networks. So it's you can go in and read about the different organizations. Contact them directly if you want. There's a lot of information here about who we are, things about what we do, and I'll just quickly go into this page. So what we do here lists some of the tasks that people do. Here on the bottom right-hand side, you start to see these are the diagrams that I talked you through earlier. So these are all available for download. We have a list of who the current coordinators are right now. All right, so somebody from Humanity Road, someone from OpenStreetMap. We have a volunteer out of the St. Bounds. What I'll draw your attention to here in this drop-down list here now is there's a couple links, one called Code of Conduct and one called Data Protection. So many of the questions I get back from people is, how do we know who these volunteers are? And how do we know they're going to be serious about data protection and security? And actually many of these groups went through those questions and they're extremely serious. Some of the groups make all their volunteers sign codes of conduct. Some of them make them go through heavy screening processes. If they're bringing on new volunteers, like in Libya, they force them through a certain review process to try to verify who they are. Data protection, they're very, very concerned. They'll probably ask you a lot of hard questions because they don't want to be the ones causing any kind of problems in terms of data getting out or identifiable information being shared publicly or anything like that. So they take this kind of material and topics very seriously. Now the Activate Us, right? So very clear tab on there. It links out here to a simple Google form. So it says kindly fill out this form, and you may contact the coordinators or simply email activate@digitalhumanitarians.com. And we've had the activation happen both ways. And a couple of documents I mentioned earlier. Now you're seeing all of the communities here now, but when you go to the site, there will just be a few of them. So this is where you can go, for example, and get the decision makers' needs diagram that I showed. That if you wanted to download, this here is the offline version, the PDF. It's a big PDF version, and you also have an online interactive version of the decision makers, and as well as being able to download all of the decision maker information in a Google Doc if you want. So, and this is also, as I mentioned earlier, there's ones like the impact evaluation. So as we release more content, all of this will be placed on the website. All right, so I'm going to leave it at that point.